Ahoy there, my name is Steve Barnes, and I invite you to listen to my TV recap podcast. It's called Sweet Child of Time, 1899, Dark, and Wheel of Time TV recaps. I'm recapping 1899 with Nate of the band Voidmaster. I'm recapping Dark with Lindsay Dunn. She's a film and TV critic. And I'm doing Wheel of Time currently with James the Marshland Monster, audio engineer and rapper, not on TV, but we'd like to see him on TV one day. Join us at Sweet Child of Time. Listen to our recaps. They're about an hour long each. We have a lot of fun. Join us. Bye. May you always find water and shade. Bye-bye.
This is episode 23, Skyfall.
James Bond's loyalty to M is put to the test when her past comes back to haunt her, and MI6 is attacked by a cyber terrorist named Silver. Bond is sent on a mission to retrieve a data chip containing information on all undercover agents around the world, and his pursuit of the chip leads him to a final showdown with Silver at the old Scottish estate of Skyfall. That is a summary of the movie. Jay, what did you remember about this before you rewatched it recently?
I didn't really remember much, Andy, considering it's one of the later Bond films. I'm sure I've mentioned this before, that the Daniel Craig films, myself and the wife have only seen each film once. So we would have watched this probably within 6 months or so, 6 to 12 months of it being released. We didn't watch it at the cinema. So it's obviously been a few years since we watched it. So I couldn't remember much about the actual plot. So I do remember that M died. So spoiler alert, everyone. She does die. So we hope you've, rewatched the film along with us. And I remember that some of the film took place in the Scottish Highlands. And I also remembered, so I didn't remember his name, Silver, but I remembered that the main villain, played by Bardem, had some kind of facial injury. And I remember the scene, when he takes out his kind of face plate out of his face. I remember it kind of being disfigured there. And also I remembered the beginning bit where Bond is shot by, it obviously turns out to be Moneypenny, on the train at the beginning. But other than that, I didn't remember much. And it's one of those, we said it before countless times. It's one of those times, when you watch the film and things are happening, and then it kind of prompts you to recall, oh yeah, that's what happened there. So when various bits where they go to his island and the interaction with the Bond girl and stuff like that, when it starts happening, that scene, you remember, oh yeah, this is when this bit happened. What about you, Andy? Did you remember quite a bit about Skyfall or not?
So Skyfall was another Bond film that I did see in the cinema. I got it on DVD as soon as it came out, watched it multiple times. I bet I've seen it 7 or 8 times in total, so I remembered quite a lot. So, brace yourselves. I remember the bike chase on the rooftops, which was followed by a fight on the train, and I then remember Bond being shot. I remember a fight and a killing in Shanghai in the skyscraper. I remember Macau, the casino. I remember Bond meeting Silver. And one of my favourite parts of the whole franchise probably was when Bond's tied to a chair and Silver's talking to him and says, "Mummy was very bad." It just makes me chuckle every time. I remember Severine's death, which was another good scene as well. The Aston Martin DB5 is back. I remember the whole piece at Skyfall, particularly Silver on the helicopter and the death of M. So I basically run through the entire film, so thanks for listening, everybody. But we'll continue with the format and hopefully add a little bit more information to that along the way. So, some information that we collect for each film. The main villains, 3 to choose from here. We've got Raoul Silver, we've got Patrice and a boat captain, and just the 2 Bond girls, Severine, who I mentioned earlier, and one simply known as Bond's Lover.
Yeah, and the theme song was sung by Adele, and it was titled Skyfall. And the opening credits, so we had Bond sinking, we also had Bond being swallowed by the seabed, we had the usual naked models, we had quite a few shots of graveyards, and also a lot of target practice cutouts as well, and then some of the targets were on fire. Then there were elements of Asian dragons as well, lots of skulls, and Craig's piercing blue eyes as well was in at least one shot. So moving on, the confirmed James Bond kills only, so the body count was 17.
Gadgets is a very short list. There was a Walther PPK-S with a palm print sensor, so only Bond could fire it, and a radio transmitter. Bond says his iconic Bond James Bond after 56 minutes and 39 seconds. He is seen drinking a martini, but there's no hat wearing or throwing. So Jay, next question. What was your favourite scene of the film?
There were two for me that stood out, Andy. One of them I will discuss later on when we kind of talk about the rewatch. The one that stood out for me the most was when Bond is captured and he's on Silver's Island and they get to meet each other for the first time, and Silver does this slow kind of walk entrance where, you know, they're in the server room and he's slowly walking to Bond and the camera, and he's just, you know, talking as well, and then they have a bit of a chit chat, and then obviously, you know, he doesn't torture him or anything, but he's, you know, where you mentioned about the quote about Mummy was very bad, that whole scene I thought was the one that stood out. So no action, but I thought it was a really good, you know, interaction between the main villain Silver and Craig's Bond. I really enjoyed that bit. What about you, Andy?
Loads to choose from for me. That scene you just mentioned was brilliant. I've cheated a little bit because I've gone for more of a sequence of scenes as opposed to a particular scene, but it's where Silver escapes from MI6, and in parallel there's a scene happening in the hearing where M is basically on trial for the recent screw-ups of MI6 and her unit. So in parallel, she's being dressed down by the government ministers, whoever it may be. Silver is escaping and he's going for M, unbeknownst to her. So it flicks back and forth between the two. But I think that whole escape scene, the action, the whole thing in the tube with the explosion and the chase, just everything about that was really, really good. And if I was being picky and had to go for a particular part of that, it would be when Silver finally gets to M and he's just about to shoot her, and then a firefight kicks off in not the courtroom, but the room where the hearing's being held. So yeah, really, really good. Next question. How many times did you reach for your phone?
0, Andy. A big fat 0. I really enjoyed this film, so I wasn't even tempted once. What about you?
Same. Even, you know, I've seen it many, many times, but when it's on, it gets my full attention. Another question that we have to ask on the rating room. What is the all-important rating? Jay, do you want to start with yours?
So, Andy, I've given it a very strong 8 out of 10. And later on, you know, when we talk about the rankings and where we place each of the Bond films, I can expand on why I did 8 out of 10. But I think that's a solid entry for me, you know, 8 out of 10. What about you, Andy? What did you think? Was your score higher than mine?
It was a slam dunk 10 out of 10 for me. Absolutely loved this film. So many things about it were good. It's, for me, in many ways, it's the perfect Bond film. And I couldn't really find any flaws in it. Maybe I could be a little bit picky with some things, and we'll get into it, but I'm rounding it to 10 because it's at least a 9.9. So it's as good a Bond film as you're ever going to get. So we obviously really like this film. What did your wife think of it, though? Did she enjoy it as much as we did?
She was making various comments throughout the film, and what I've done here, I've kind of consolidated everything into one kind of paragraph, because she was just saying things throughout the film. But what she did say at the very end of the film, and she, you know, this is what she said. She said, "I'm no feminist, but they replaced the female M with a man, and then they took the female field agent, who we obviously find out to be Moneypenny, and put her behind the desk." And then she also said some bits look dated with the green screen, and I noticed this as well, so I don't know what your views were on this, and it was most noticeable on the motorbike chase scene at the beginning, you know, where he's chasing Patrice and they're going over all the rooftops and everything. Now, we wasn't too sure if this is due to us watching the film on DVD, and our TV is a big one, Andy, but it's not a smart TV or anything, so we weren't quite sure whether it was to do with that. So it'd be interesting to see what your comments are around the green screen. Also, she said the scene where Bond meets Q for the first time in the art gallery, she said this was like Benjamin Button, but I didn't include that in the notes because I think logically it probably wasn't like it, because, you know, it's not the same character getting older or younger. But what she said here was Bond was getting older and Q is getting younger, whereas in the other films it's the opposite way. Q is a lot older than Bond. So I thought that was quite an interesting observation. And also, she said when Bond is meeting Kincaid at Skyfall, you know, Bond's old house, she said this felt very much like Bruce Wayne and Alfred in, you know, from the Batman films. And also the scene where Kincaid, Bond and M are kind of fitting out the house, you know, before Silver arrives. She said this feels like a kind of a grown-up version of a Home Alone film. So what's your thoughts about the green screen? Is that something you picked up, or are we watching it, you know, on an old, well, not an old DVD, but a DVD and a bit of an older TV, so it's kind of showing through?
I can't say I noticed it too much. I was watching on Blu-ray, so, you know, maybe there's some quality enhancement with that anyway, but I don't think it was enough to kind of notice for me. So it wasn't as egregious as, say, Die Another Day, where some of the green screen was really, really ropey. So I thought it was absolutely fine. I do like the comment about it being a Home Alone film, because I have the exact same thought myself. It's just on the right side of being serious. If they'd have taken it any further, it goes a little bit silly. But for me, it was just about the right balance. But I completely agree with the sentiment there. And spoiler alert, I said my wife has agreed to watch the final film. She actually watched this film with me, so I can bring my own wife verdict to the table this week. Kind of. She watched the first 2/3 of the film. She was starting to fall asleep just as Silver was escaping, which I think was around the 1.5 hour mark, so about 2/3 I think she watched. She didn't really enjoy it, if I'm honest. I was disappointed for her, and I was disappointed in her as well for her poor taste. But she wasn't really enjoying it. A few things I noted down that she said. So there's the scene where Bond is following Patrice into the building in Shanghai. She said, "Why is he dawdling?" And I don't know. I think that's probably a valid question, because he did hang back. And she also said that the action was too slow, which I don't agree with necessarily, but she felt it was too slow. And my selling point to her was that the Craig films are kind of standalone. They're not like the other Bond films, and I stand by that comment. I think that's a fair assessment. But she said, "I don't see how they're any different to the other Bond films," which I don't know. Maybe that's because she's not really paid attention to them like we have, never really watched them, or she's got an idea in her head of what she thinks they are. But yeah, what it does mean is that her agreement to watch No Time to Die with me has maybe fallen by the wayside, because I've ruined things with Skyfall. But, you know, she tried, so she gets brownie points for that at least.
Yeah, and Andy, considering you gave Skyfall 10 out of 10, I know in earlier episodes you mentioned that she's watched some of Casino Royale from memory.
She did, yeah. Again, not particularly a fan of that. You know, I thought it was a way to get her into Bond, because, you know, everything starts again with new rules and new ways of doing things, but it wasn't to be. And I'm a little bit surprised, just because she's a really big fan of the Jason Bourne films, and it's been said, and it's hard to argue, that there are similarities between Craig's Bond and Matt Damon's Bourne. So yeah, maybe she's got something preconceived in her head that's kind of stopping her from enjoying Bond. But it's not for everyone, I suppose.
No, and I think, in terms of the comment of it, the action being too slow, like you said earlier on, obviously we're talking about rankings later on, but you said something like this was like the perfect James Bond, or the blend of all the different Bond elements. So in terms of your wife liking anymore, if you're giving this the 10 out of 10, I don't think she's gonna enjoy any of the others if this is kind of like the pinnacle in your scoring. Obviously, like we said before, it's all subjective. I've given it an 8 out of 10. We can talk about rankings later on. But yeah, so she fell asleep just as Silver was escaping, which is what your favourite scene as well, wasn't it?
It was indeed, yeah. It was really bad timing, because I think from that point onwards, I think she really might have enjoyed it, because I think the film, we'll talk about it later, but the film really kicks into gear in many ways. I think the only thing that would save it now is if to get her involved in the Bond franchise going forward would be if they did actually cast Idris Elba in the role. Either that or Will Smith. But something tells me neither of those gentlemen are going to take up the mantle in future. So I think it's a lost cause. But time will tell.
Andy, if Will Smith was cast as James Bond, and that's a name I've never seen linked to James Bond, I wonder if Chris Rock would be willing to be the main villain.
He could be the Blofeld to his Bond, couldn't he? He'd be the Fresh Prince of MI6. It would be. Yeah. We could make that now. Combine Fresh Prince with Skyfall. Instead of Kincaid, it could be Uncle Phil looking after the house for him. Instead of Felix Leiter, you'd have Carlton as his go-to. A very different film we've created here. Let's get back onto the real Bond. A couple more facts. Runtime was 2 hours 23 minutes, which feels like one of the longer ones. We'll figure that out later when we get to the rankings. Released in 2012, 50-year anniversary of Bond, of course, and was directed by Sam Mendes.
So just before I move on to the budget, Andy, you've obviously just mentioned that it was 2 hours 23 minutes and you gave it a 10 out of 10. For me, it didn't feel like 2 hours 23 minutes. I wouldn't say it flew by, but like we both said, we didn't check our phone, so it didn't feel there was any kind of lulls in it, in the plot. Everything kind of steadily moved on. So the 2 hour 23 minutes, it was a good runtime.
It was filled to the brim with action and drama. Yeah, there was no lulls, like you said.
Yeah, no filler content there. So I like to kick off the general points talking about the budget and the box office stats. How did Skyfall get a 10 out of 10 for Andy's scoring here? And they did that by spending $200 million on the budget. And that, interestingly, Andy, is a reduction of $30 million compared to Quantum of Solace. And if you recall, listeners, last week's episode, Quantum of Solace, was actually the shortest Bond film. So I don't have the figures to hand. Obviously, we can talk about runtimes later, but you've got more Bond content, but you're actually getting it for $30 million less. So that sounds very efficient of the producers. And this is an interesting fact as well, that the 3 Craig films that we've had so far have a combined budget of $532 million. That is $40 million short of all the other Bond film budgets so far, which I found very interesting, Andy. And obviously you've got inflation and everything, but when we talk about the box office and the budgets later on, which, if I recall, is one of your points, you see that step change in budget in each film, don't you? Especially during the Brosnan era as well. So what does that mean in terms of all the budget? So the box office stats: Skyfall had an adjusted box office performance of $1.4 billion, and that is a franchise high so far. And obviously Andy's going to talk about the box office ratings later on, and what we can do as well, Andy's going to run through what does Daniel Craig's combined box office takings look like, and also what is the average box office per movie.
Yeah, lots of money talk to come. Now, interesting point here, Skyfall is the first Bond film with an original title not to be novelised. Skyfall is also the third Bond film in which the primary Bond girl dies. So we've got On Her Majesty's Secret Service and Casino Royale where that also happened. And it's a first where her death occurs part way through the film rather than at the end. So if you remember back to Tracy in On Her Majesty's Secret Service and Vesper in Casino Royale, kind of pretty much closing scenes or thereabouts for each of those films. Not the case with Skyfall.
That is interesting. And Andy, I wonder what your thoughts on this is as part of the research that we do for each episode, we do extensive research. And for me, I think one of the things why it didn't get a higher score than 8 out of 10 is that it lacks the Bond girl factor for me. But doing the research, some people kind of argue that M is kind of like the Bond girl in this movie. She gets a lot of screen time.
She is very much a damsel in distress, isn't she? That Bond has to rescue. So that is an interesting argument to include her in the rankings or not. I'll put her straight at the top. What a woman. But no, interesting. And a good point you make around Bond girls or lack thereof, which obviously we'll talk about in great detail later when we get to the rankings review. I understand the point. I'm not going to argue against it. However, what I would say is I don't feel like the film was missing anything as a result, in my opinion.
Yeah, I was thinking, so when I was doing my rankings, I thought, if it had more Bond girl action, not in terms of the volume of Bond girls, because sometimes Bond will have multiple either Bond girls in there or lovers. Obviously we have the bit at the beginning when he goes not AWOL, but he disappears, and then we got Severin, and like you said, she dies part way through, so there's that lacking bit. But then you think, if there was a Bond girl in there, is that kind of just slowing down the plot? How is she going to participate in the plot and not slow things down? Because a lot of this revolves around Bond and Silver, and having another element in there. The only way I think they could do it is if you had someone like a Jinx or Wei Lin. Potentially,
yeah, but it'd be difficult for me to think how to weave that into the existing story. But it's good to play matchmaker sometimes. Or maybe one of the ways Silver gets revenge is to steal her away from Bond rather than Bond stealing the girl away from the villain. That's a new twist on things.
So anyway, we kind of digressed there, Andy. I just wanted there's a question I had there that I wanted to kind of pose to you. So getting back to the film, this is the second Bond film after The World Is Not Enough in which M is placed in jeopardy, and it also makes her the first major recurring non-villainous Bond film character to die on screen. And also another first, so this is Dame Judi Dench became the first person in a Bond film to utter the F word in full.
Yeah, so that means we can't talk about that scene in the quotes at the end, because we don't say F on the podcast. Javier Bardem is the first Spanish actor to play a James Bond villain, and the second Oscar winner to appear in a Bond film after Christopher Walken. Benicio del Toro won an Oscar, of course, but that was after he appeared in License to Kill, hence he's not included there. So notes on the production. So Skyfall was actually delayed several months in 2010 and 11 due to the bankruptcy and delayed sale of Studio MGM. And with production being officially suspended in April 2010 and resuming 9 months later in January of 2011. And then final point from me before I hand back to you, Jay, and this I thought was quite interesting. There was discussion about bringing Sean Connery into this film to play the part of Kincaid, but the discussions ended pretty early. It was felt it would be too distracting and take audiences out of the movie, which I have to say I agree with. And also there was rumours that this would lead people to believe that James Bond is actually a code name and not a person. And I must say, when I read that, it's an interesting idea, but it would be weird to see Sean Connery in a Bond film not as Bond.
I agree, because he he couldn't play a James Bond, even if they went with the James Bond was a code name. Can you imagine Sean Connery's James Bond after all his exploits in his films going to retire in the Scottish Highlands as a gamekeeper? In all his films, he pretty much spent most of his time in the Bahamas. That's where you would imagine Sean Connery's James Bond retiring to.
Yeah, surrounded by bikini-clad Bond girls and doing what Bond always did. So yeah, it wouldn't work in the role, but it was an interesting idea. But I think they made the right choice by kiboshing it.
Yeah, I agree, definitely. It'd be nice to do some kind of throwback, but I wonder if you could do it where you basically have the actor, but then he just wears so much makeup that you can't even tell it's Sean Connery. So if he was in a Star Wars film, he would basically be like a stormtrooper, one of those guys in the white, so you don't even know it's him, but it's a little nod that Sean Connery's come back to James Bond. The Rain Room. Moving on, this is just a quick one because we've got quite a lot of content to go through because it's such a good film. So Goose and continuity error. I've just got the one and Andy's got one. So when Bond and Q meet for the first time, there's a continuity mistake here where Bond's coat is positioned differently on the front and the back shots, and that's where they sat down on the bench and they're looking forward, and then the camera goes between the front and back.
Yeah, and another one is a deliberate mistake. It's in the London Underground. Bond and Silver slide down between the escalators. To obviously, I think Bond's chasing, isn't it? So there's a quick way down. Use the middle as a slide. But in real life, you've got signs at regular intervals, and I thought this as it happened. Like, surely the signs would hurt. Basically saying like, don't climb or don't run or something to that effect. And obviously, those signs have been removed to allow for that scene to happen.
I've seen so many clips on, say, YouTube or TikTok of people sliding down, the London Underground bit, and then you see them just hit those and they go flying off.
And they deserve it. Silly people.
Indeed, you won't catch us doing that, Andy. The Rain Room. So let's actually get into the film now. So we've had some general facts and some, opinions from myself and Andy. So let's get into it. And as usual, we're going to kick us off with the opening scene. So usually, although we didn't do this last week with Quantum of Solace, we're going to talk about the gun barrel. But like Quantum of Solace, the gun barrel sequence actually takes place at the end of the film again. So Mendes did intend to place a gun barrel sequence at the front. However, he felt it would be better at the end of the film. Yeah,
so that's all three Craig films where the gun barrel is not in its usual place. So we're straight into the film. Let's go to Turkey. That's the first scene. Bond silhouette appears in the corridor, pulls out a gun. I thought the silhouette was a good alternative to the gun barrel because the very first thing you see is the silhouette, and as the music kicks in with the kind of da-da, which is not Jaws. That wasn't a Jaws impression. that was the Bond music. Honest. But I thought it was really, really good as an alternative way to introduce Bond into the film. So Bond is trying to help Ronson, who's clearly been shot or stabbed or something, but he's told to go after the safe drive. I thought this was really cold by him, where she just tells Bond to leave him quite forcefully. We meet Eve, not introduced by name yet, but her name is Eve, who also works for MI6. We then get the customary car chase, and the goon that they're chasing down has an automatic pistol with an ammo drum. That then leads into a motorbike chase. Yeah, and this is a chase, so the chase ends up on a moving train, and Bond and Patrice are fighting on top of the train. There's a moment here where Craig kind of enters the carriage, and as he does, he kind of straightens his suit, and it kind of brought back memories of when Brosnan straightened his tie in GoldenEye, when he's on a tank. But also, I think, is it The World Is Not Enough or Die Another Day, where he's under the water and he does it as well? World Is Not Enough. Yeah, when the opening scene in the Thames. Yes, yeah. So I thought that when
Craig did that, it just reminded me of Brosnan. And I don't know whether any other Bond actors have done that, because I know we picked it up when Brosnan did it in GoldenEye, but I'm just trying to think if there's any kind of little nods there where, you know, Bond is explicitly like straightening his tie, you know, his suit or tie. But that's the thing I really picked up, you know, when Craig comes through and he does that little thing, it was straightening his sleeves and stuff. And so, you know, we find out it's Eve, but Eve accidentally shoots Bond after being given a command by M to carry out the shot, even though it's not a clean shot. And Bond falls off the train and lands in the body of water from such a great height that you... Well, what do you think happens, Andy?
Well, I mean, surely he's dead, right? I mean, rest in
Surely.
peace, James Bond. He's got to be dead. It's very early in the film to kill off James Bond, has to be said. I thought it was a really, really good opening sequence. Really, really enjoyed that. Which then takes us into the title sequence and music. That's Skyfall by Adele, of course. Won an Academy Award for Best Original Song in the 2013 Academy Awards, making it the first Bond theme song to win an Oscar. 3 other Bond themes have been nominated for an Oscar, of course. Live and Let Die, For Your Eyes Only, and Nobody Does It Better, being the other 3.
And obviously Andy mentioned that Adele sings the Skyfall theme song, and Adele is a 16 Grammy Award, well, at the time of recording, Andy, she's a 16-time Grammy Awards winner and also 12 Brit Awards, and she's won lots and lots of other awards. And we've not covered everything there, but you kind of get the picture there that she's very successful in awards and also record sales. And David Arnold is not composing the music for Skyfall, so Thomas Newman has come in to replace Arnold, and this is the 9th different composer in the franchise so far. And Newman and Mendes know each other because they've worked together on a number of different projects, including American Beauty, Road to Perdition, and Jarhead. 3 films that I've seen, Andy, but I think my favourite out of those are probably Road to Perdition, which obviously featured Daniel Craig in as well.
Indeed it did, and I didn't put 2 and 2 together. They'd already worked together previously, but yeah, 3 really, really good films. And Road to Perdition, Tom Hanks film, isn't it? It
is indeed. It is
interesting. One final point on the soundtrack. So the Skyfall soundtrack doesn't actually contain the theme song sung by Adele, which is only the 2nd time so far that this has happened. The other one being Casino Royale. I'm not sure if we talked about why that might be in the Casino Royale episode, and I don't really know why here, but it does seem very, very strange that the main song would be omitted.
I think it's very strange, but then I wondered whether it was to do with royalties from the singles, and by having it on the album, does that mess things up? Does that skew things in terms of how much money they need to pay Adele? I don't know. When we found this, I thought it was very strange. And why would you start with Casino Royale? Because Chris Cornell, obviously, lots of people do like him, but he's not at the same level as Adele, is he? It just seems a bit weird that they've started, during the Craig run. Unless, I don't know, But then why haven't they done it with Quantum of Solace?
It's really interesting, and surely when you're approaching artists to create a Bond song, isn't that part of the discussion? But maybe they wanted Adele so much that they were willing to sacrifice the album sales. I don't know. Very, very strange decision, though, has to be said. But let's get back into the film. So from the title sequence, we're off to London. M is shown writing Bond's obituary, so he is dead after all. We're then introduced to Ralph Fiennes, or Rafe Fiennes, depending on how you pronounce his name. I'm going to say Ralph for the purposes of this episode, and if it is Rafe, I apologise, but, spell your name properly. Ralph plays the character Gareth Marley. No, he doesn't. Ralph plays the character Gareth Mallory, easy for me to say, who's the chairman of Intelligence and Security Committee.
And M is being put under pressure to retire as well by Mallory, because obviously you find out Silver's released the 5 agents' names online as well.
Yes, political moves at play here. This is there's something more going on, isn't there?
There is, and when this was happening, I was trying to think, we've never really seen M, in terms of the whole franchise so far, Andy, we've never really seen M under that kind of political pressure before, have we? You know, where they're kind of questioning or kind of forcing her or suggesting to M that she needs to retire.
It's the first time where I think we see her as underneath someone. Not that, and I don't know if Mallory is her boss, and the reason I think that we'll find out later on in the film, but it does seem that she is being talked down to in some ways. And I think the only thing that comes to mind when you said about her not really being challenged is in Tomorrow Never Dies, where she's having the argument with the, well, I can't remember what rank he is, but basically the very important army dude, to give him his official title. But she basically bats him off because she's right and he's wrong, so she puts him in his place. But that's the only time there's any sort of challenge on him that I can think of up till this point.
Is that the bit where she says about not having balls or...
Yeah. That's the bit.
Yeah. So we see M and Tanner are travelling back to MI6, and they find out someone is actually hacking into MI6 at that time as well, and they find out actually it's coming from M's office, and then they get stopped on the bridge. I don't know which bridge it is, but there's a nearby bridge near MI6, and we then see M's office get blown up. So moving on, we now find out Bond is alive, Andy, so you'd be pleased to hear. And I don't think the location of this place is revealed. So I've put down destination unknown. So I'm not too sure it says anything about which island Bond is on. So, you know, if anyone out there actually knows where Bond is on this island with this beautiful lady, let us know. So we see Bond hooking up with this woman, and he's then seen drinking in bed, the drinking in bed together as well. And then Bond goes kind of on a night stroll along the beach, and you think, oh, it's nice and romantic. But then he's walking to the bar anyway, so he's just going for a drink down at his local bar.
Bond's looking really old and tired, isn't he, in this scene? He's beat up, and he just kind of looks down and out. Like, he's drinking, and he's... It's like he's not got a care in the world, but I don't mean that in a positive light. It's just it's like he's just existing rather than living. We see Bond in a bar pretty soon after that, and he's playing this kind of drinking game which involves a scorpion. So he's got like the scorpion on his hand, and he's got the glass in the same hand. And I guess the idea is to drink the drink before the scorpion stings and maybe kills him. And the following morning he's still in the bar, and he's a bit worse for wear, and he reaches over and grabs another bottle, but then he sees a news report on the TV about the MI6 bombing.
Andy, I've done a few drinking games in my younger days, and that is not one that has come up before in our drinking venues. I'm just trying to think. Obviously, it hasn't come up at all, but I was just thinking logistically, is that scorpion particularly famous for being venomous? And if so, can you just imagine, like, when people just die, does the barman just have to like ring up like the local person to dispose of the bodies? How does it work, if it is a poisonous scorpion?
I mean, I'm guessing there are non-poisonous scorpions, but when I think scorpion, I think poisonous, kind of by default. Either way, it's really weird. Yeah, and I've never played such a drinking game either. I think the only drinking game I've played that involves any sort of animal reference is Chicken Eyes.
I don't know that one, but we don't have to describe it now.
Yeah, I won't explain the rules now, but it's a very silly game.
I've done a James Bond drinking game before, which I can't remember if I've mentioned it before, but I lost it because I said Louis Armstrong was the theme song for James Bond, and obviously it's not a theme song, as we discussed earlier on in the podcast season for On Her Majesty's Secret Service. So we then jump to London, and we see M is stood beside a number of different coffins draped in a Union Jack flag. And M goes home, and we can see a silhouette in the background, and it's Bond, and he's in M's place again, actually. And Bond is looking really rough, as Andy mentioned, and he's just really disgruntled. especially when M tells Bond that his place has been sold and he can't sleep at her place as well. So he's going to have to go and stay at a local hotel or maybe a hostel.
Yeah, it's a nice interaction between the two, I thought. But it does mean Bond is back, of course, in brackets, subject to testing. So they go to MI6 New Digs, as they are referred to, which is part of an old Churchill bunker. Bond has to go through an assessment process before he can return to duty, hence the testing comment. He's got some sort of shooting range and he's missing a lot. And then we get a pretty funny scene between Bond and a profiler. Stay tuned, because Jay and I are going to recreate that scene live and in living colour, audio only, later on in the podcast. But throughout all these tests, Bond is showing a lot of weakness. He's lacking fitness. He's quite vulnerable as well, isn't he? It's a side of Bond we rarely see. But yeah, it's not looking good for him, it has to be said. But we get Bond and Mallory meeting for the first time as well. And Bond's told he's back. He's passed his tests, so off he goes. But then once he leaves the room, M tells Tanner Bond actually failed the tests.
So she's sending out an agent that is not match fit, Andy. This is like going for a cup final with your star man, not quite there, but he's willing to take the risk.
This is was it Wayne Rooney going to the World Cup with a broken metatarsal?
I was thinking
Beckham before that as well.
Yeah, I was thinking the same. So Bond and Q meet for the first time, and obviously I mentioned this in the goof and continuity segment. And this is the first time where, during Craig's version of Bond, where he meets Q, and Q is played by Ben Whishaw. And Craig and Whishaw also featured together on Layer Cake, and that's a film I've rewatched not too long ago, actually. And Whishaw is the fourth actor to play Q, and he's featured in a range of different films. And the first one, Andy, is one that my wife recognised the voice, and that was Paddington Bear. So my wife mentioned that as soon as he came on, she said, "Oh, that's the voice of Paddington Bear." And he was also in The Danish Girl, Mary Poppins Returns, and Cloud Atlas, which is another film that Tom Hanks has been in as well, Andy. You obviously mentioned earlier on Road to Perdition and Mary Poppins Returns. I wonder if that's the one with Emily Blunt, because I've not seen the new Mary Poppins film.
It is indeed. I went to the cinema to see it. It was quite enjoyable. Fun film.
Was it worth paying for?
Not the prices as our cinema charges. You know, it's a bit more local to you. It's bloody expensive.
And Whishaw has won several awards, including a couple of Emmy Awards, actually, for Best Actor in Criminal Justice and Outstanding Supporting Actor for A Very English Scandal.
Q gives Bond his gun and a radio, and Bond is quite disappointed. There's a lack of tech, a lack of gadgets, and Q says something along the lines of, "What were you expecting? An exploding pen? We don't really go in for that sort of thing anymore." Which I thought was a nice nod to the past, whilst also acknowledging that things have changed.
It was a nice nod. And Andy, when watching this, with the lack of gadgets, I know I've mentioned this a few times, but every time a Bond film has very few gadgets, I just think of the very first Bond film, Dr. No, and the Geiger counter. It just brings back memories of that. But these are practical gadgets.
Yeah, this is not convoluted tech. This is need to have stuff. From there, we are on to Shanghai and Macau next. So in Shanghai, we see Bond following Patrice, and then Bond has to follow a trail of dead bodies in the building. Bond, he has to hang from the bottom of an ascending lift. So Patrice gets in the lift. Bond doesn't want to be seen, so as the lift starts to ascend, Bond runs after it, grabs hold, and he's hanging on for dear life as the lift ascends to follow Patrice up to a floor much, much higher up in the building.
So this next scene is the one that I mentioned earlier on in terms of my favourite scene. Well, I kind of alluded to that there was another one. And this is it. And I just think this scene is just really well done. So it features Bond making his way through this dark, empty floor of this building. And it's just filled with like glass doors and walls. And you've got these neon lights from outside of these advertisement boards as well. And it just really adds to the scene. And they're not just normal advertising boards. They're the kind of ones you get in like big cities where you kind of got like moving images. It's not just like the advertisement boards where you get like a logo or the name of the company. This one from memory was either octopuses or squids kind of floating around the advertisement board. So this was my runner-up of my favourite scene in Skyfall. And Patrice shoots an art collector here. And I thought this was a bit weird, Andy, because I don't think it's ever explained who the art collector is and why he was taken out. So unless I missed something, but also this is the first time we see the Bond girl Severine. And also when this happens, the bodyguards of Severine just basically pick up the body. So obviously it's a planned hit and they were involved with setting it up. So unless I've missed something, do they talk about the art collector, or is that just some kind of random job that Bond's kind of come across and that's the kind of like his in then to the Bond girl and the scene that we're going to see later on with the casino?
Yeah, you're right. I don't think it is explained. My thinking now you've pointed that out is that maybe this is simply a way to tell the viewers that Patrice is a hitman without, explicitly saying Patrice is a hitman, or, him wearing a jacket that says hitman assistant manager or something on the label. But yeah, I wonder if this is just a happenstance, a happy coincidence that Bond has stumbled across Patrice doing his job and taken advantage of the situation.
I didn't write this down, but an interesting tidbit, and I've just checked my quiz to make sure I didn't ask you this. And do you know Patrice, in all the scenes that he's in, he doesn't actually speak?
I did notice that, yeah. He's another one of those silent henchmen. There's probably been a few of them throughout the series so far. But yeah, I guess no words needed sometimes.
I'm glad I didn't put that on the quiz then, because you did notice that, so I'm glad I did.
This is less about watching the film and more about homework for a potential quiz. That's what this is. But Patrice, doesn't have any words, but he does have some fists, and him and Bond have a bit of a scrap. Really, really cool scene. You see the kind of silhouettes of the two men fighting against all the neon lights and the darkness and the kind of the changing light and dark of the building because of the really, really cool looking scene. And as you mentioned, this is where we see Severine. So after Patrice falls to his death, we see the lady opposite in the building, and she's looking at Bond. And I think it was a good way for them to kind of introduce themselves to each other without actually being able to speak. So they're looking across each other from building to building. Later on, Bond is back at his hotel. He's having a shave, and Eve turns up. Lot of flirting going on here. We find out that Q is scared of flying, which goes against earlier portrayals of Q, where he was on location on a number of occasions. And Eve takes hold of the razor to shave Bond for him, rather than him doing it himself.
So my observation here, Andy, is you mentioned earlier on that they haven't explicitly said her name is Eve at the very beginning, when she shoots Bond. Now, like I said earlier on, I've only seen the film twice, and this being the second time. Now, I don't recall if I knew who Eve is at this point in time. So, because I know you said you watched it 7 times, and I watched it years ago. So I can't remember if it was kept quiet that she was Moneypenny until the end, or as part of the build-up and marketing of Skyfall, was it publicly known that Naomi Harris was Miss Moneypenny? Do you recall?
I don't recall it being known beforehand, and I could be wrong on this, but I seem to remember being pleasantly surprised, when it turns out that she was actually Moneypenny all along. And with the way that the reveal happens, I know we're kind of jumping ahead, but the way the reveal happens towards the end of the film, it wouldn't make sense to reveal that information in advance, I don't think. So I'm gonna bet a small amount of money to say that it wasn't known in advance.
It is well done how they do it, isn't it, actually?
It is. Yeah, I think it is. I think it really sets the tone for future Bond films, potentially. But yeah, it's a good reveal. We'll get onto that at the end. So I mentioned I'd put a small amount of money on it. Bond's got a casino chip that he got from Patrice, and when he goes to the casino in Macau, he cashes in. Turns out it's 4 million euros in a briefcase. And he's approached by Severine. I think I don't know if this is ever called out, but it's certainly implied that she has some involvement in the running of the casino, or or she's related to the guy in charge for sure. So she makes herself known to Bond. She's accompanied by a number of bodyguards, and they have a bit of a conversation. And Bond goes to leave, but he's confronted by the bodyguards because Severine kind of warned him, they're going to kill you. I made a note just in general. I won't go through the scene in great detail, but basically they have a chat. She says he's going to die, and then onto the bodyguard. The bodyguards approach, but she's clearly scared. Something is not right with her. Something is off, and Bond notices it in her behaviour and her demeanour.
Yeah, definitely. I wouldn't even say she was put under pressure to kind of flip, sides. She was definitely working, I can't think of the word, Andy, duress for the main villain. She's not someone like on the top where she just basically loves her job of being a villain. She's definitely not at ease, and she pretty much reveals that Bond's in trouble straight away in that little conversation, so she's not hiding any cards there. And we later see Severine waiting on the yacht, hoping that Bond has survived a casino attack, and one of the goons comes in, and she kind of looks up, kind of expecting it's Bond, but then you see her having a shower, and Bond arrives and kind of slips into the shower with her, and then obviously they're intimate, and Bond and Severine are actually taken prisoner by the crew, which was a bit of a weird one because they both stood. So Bond, is it Bond that comes out first, or is it Severine? But they basically end up walking to the end of the yacht, and then they start talking, and then the boat captain and the whatever they call boatman. What do they call people that work on a ship?
The crew?
The crewmen, that's it. All then just like pull the guns out. So it's like, unless they've been watching her on some kind of webcam in the shower and they see what's happened and they reported it back to Silver. But they're taken to Silver's Island, which in real life the island is known as Hashima Island. And it's part of Japan, and Hashima Island is an abandoned and uninhabited island that was previously used for coal mining and labour camp during World War II, and it's a place you can actually visit, Andy. So if we ever make lots and lots of money of this podcast, we've got to do the GoldenEye dam jump, and we've got to go and visit Hashima Island, I think.
Yeah, we'll add that to the bucket list. And it's on the island where Bond meets Silver for the first time. It's in this kind of like large server room. Bond's tied up to the chair. This is a scene we briefly touched on earlier. Silver comes down the stairs. He's slowly walking towards Bond as he's talking away, and he starts touching Bond up, kind of stroking his chest and his shoulders a little bit in quite a seductive way, I suppose you might say. And he makes some comment about he's not really interested in all the physical stuff. It's because it's so dull. And I think Bond, he says something about it being Bond's first time, and Bond replies with something like, "What makes you think this is my first time?" Which I thought was quite amusing. And this is also the part where the aforementioned "Mommy was very bad" quotes up, because Silver tells Bond that he didn't pass his test after all. He says, like, what did you get on your shooting? And Bond says 70. And he says, no, 40. And then he starts, he puts up on one of the screens that Bond can see, failed this test, failed this test, failed this test. Mommy was very bad. It's an absolute classic.
That kind of interaction just reminds me of being at school, where you basically tell your parents that, yeah, I passed my exams, and then they just say, oh, actually your teacher phoned and you did this, you did that. I don't remember that quote, Andy, before watching that film, so obviously you did, and obviously this is when it happened.
Yeah, it's just a great interaction, and I just think that line is just stuck with me. It's just so good. You mentioned the kind of the entrance as well. I thought really the elaborate way he entered the room and he's talking to Bond, it reminded me of that old school Bond villain from back in the day. And the next bit, so he unties him and they go outside, and they're just walking around. You know, there are goons around with guns, of course, but he's not restraining Bond or dragging him around. They're just walking and talking like gentlemen. Reminded me back in the old days when the villains and Bond used to get along quite nicely until Bond killed him. But we go outside. Severine is tied to some kind of ruined structure. She's been slapped about a bit, hasn't she? And Silver gets out some old pistols. They look like antique pistols or whatever they are. And he puts a shot glass on her head with a drink in, and basically says, let's play a game. And I mean, this is where Severine dies. This is the death of Severine. But it's hilarious to me. It's just, I found it really amusing because it's the way he explains the rules of the game, and it's basically you've got to knock the shot glass off her head to win. So Bond obviously doesn't want to shoot her because if he misses the shot glass, he might shoot her in the head. So he shoots and he deliberately misses, but gets close. And Silver just nonchalantly just shoots her in the chest, and she flops over, and he wins. And I found it really amusing. It's quite sadistic as well when you think about it, but funny as well.
I didn't remember that she died so quickly, because she doesn't have much screen time, does she? In terms of, you know, we had her in the sniper scene, not talking. Then we've had that brief interaction at the casino, the shower scene, not talking, a bit at the front of the yacht. Then when they get to the island, she's taken away while he's gone to meet Silver, and then she appears there, and then she's shot. So she doesn't get much screen time at all, and she's the primary Bond girl. Short and sweet is her screen time. And this is another instance of the Bond girl not making it to the end of the film, and you know we've mentioned a few times, haven't we, where that's happened as well. And Andy, it just occurred to me, Andy, and correct me if I'm wrong. This in Skyfall, even though Silver and Bond do share a number of scenes together, they don't actually have a physical fight, do they? From memory,
I don't think that they do.
Because they have a chase scene. But Bond is trying to catch up because obviously he was in a different part of the underground, you know, Churchill's bunker. This bit, Bond disarms the crewman. So, you know, he disables the goons and then backup arrives, but they don't actually physically fight. Skyfall's in the bit where M's being, you know, the committee, they're having a shootout, but they don't actually get near each other. In Skyfall, they don't actually get near each other, but then obviously how it ends, we talk about later on. So it just occurred to me they don't actually physically fight unless it's with weapons.
No fisticuffs, no hand-to-hand combat. It's not mano a mano. It's gunno a gunno. Cut that. That's a terrible pun.
So we move on now to London, and M meets Silver. So this is the first time that we've seen them together. And Silver's talking about being abandoned and tortured, and that he tried to kill himself by taking a cyanide in you know, that a lot of people well, apparently a lot of people in films have this cyanide capsule in their teeth. I wonder if that's true. You see it a lot in films. But however, obviously, he mentioned that cyanide burned the insides of Silver, and this is where he takes out his prosthetic mouth, cheek piece as well. You can kind of see all the damage that is done to the bone structure. I thought that was well done, in terms of the graphics. But then he takes it out, and his skin kind of flops, and you see it's all disfigured. And then when he plops it in, it kind of all fits back again. It's kind of like a memory foam kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a really cool visual. I thought this was, I don't know if it was intended as such, but almost an homage to Jaws, just because of the nature of the injury. But the setup with him in kind of an enclosed, it's like a glass tube in the middle of the room, isn't it? It's like really heavy security. It's quite a good visual. Emmy, she's trying to be tough and cold, which, as she can be, but there's clearly some hidden emotion, and she's showing some remorse. Silver was not just any other agent. I think it's clear from this scene that Silver meant a lot to her, probably in the same way that Bond means a lot to her. Really, really well acted, I thought. Very, very good scene.
So Andy, sorry, interrupt you. I've just had a thought. So he obviously worked for M. So he's worked for MI6. So he's not a double O agent, though, is he? Is he just someone that works for MI6 that was based in China?
I thought he was a double O.
So if he was a double O, so I don't know if it's mentioned, and listeners let us know. So does that mean, I might have missed something here, but does that mean Bond and Silver know each other? Because, going back to the Sean Connery days, when they had, in some of the films, they had the big briefing and they had all the double O agents sat near each other. Have they not crossed paths before? Because it doesn't, from memory, there's no indication of them going, "Oh, Silver, I remember you at the Christmas party," or something like that. I don't recall any kind of things.
I think they got around this by Silver mentions that he was stationed in Hong Kong. Silver mentioned he was stationed in Hong Kong, and I think he said between 86 and 97. So he applied a timeline to it, and I think if we're going with the assumption that Bond only became a double O at the time of Casino Royale, which was 06, then I think the implication is that Silver had already left the fold by the time Bond joined. Would be my thinking.
No, that seems logical.
And it also dispels the previous timeline of continuation from Brosnan, because obviously that would coincide with Dalton and Brosnan. So maybe they knew Silver back in a previous life. But yeah, so back to the scene. Q has got Silver's laptop. He's about to hack into it to find out what's going on. And he tells Bond that there's only 6 people who can bypass the encryption. And Bond asks him if he can hack it, to which Q replies that he created the encryption.
That made me chuckle, that bit. I thought that was well done. So, sorry Andy, I'm going off on a tangent here. So now Andy, if you develop some encryption software, and there are only 6 people in the world that can bypass it, would you say that is a success, or would you say that's a failure because 6 people can still crack it?
It depends how you look at it, because 8 billion can't, but 6 can. But I guess you need at least 1 to crack it, right? Otherwise, you encrypt it for what reason? For your own purpose, and then you die with it, and I don't know. But yeah, it's...
it's a thought that just occurred to me, that's all. But I thought that was really good, actually, Andy, where you just mentioned that. So Silver manages to escape from his cell, and Bond chases Silver. There's a couple of quotes here that made me chuckle again. So these last few, these scenes around here did make me laugh. So it's not all serious in Skyfall. And there's 2 bits here where Bond jumps on the train as it's leaving, and the commuter says, I think he says it to his wife, he's keen to get home. And then shortly followed by Bond obviously landing on the train. There's a female, I don't know if she's a driver at the back end or whatever it is, they have one at the front.
She must be the backseat driver. Quite literally.
And it just says about Bond, then says health and safety, carry on. And I just thought those little bits there did make me chuckle.
Yeah, nice scene there. So we're getting to, this is the scene I mentioned earlier as my favourite, or sequence of scenes, I guess it were. So Bond catches up to Silver. They're in a part of the underground that's not used, it seems, by the public. There seems to be a lot of empty space down there. And Silver triggers an explosion. I think he even makes a funny comment, because at this point he's dressed as a policeman, isn't he? He's got like the police radio, and he says, we've got this thing called a radio, which kind of brought back the memories of the early scene with Q and Bond. And as he clicks the radio, it blows a hole in the side of the wall, and a tube train ends up crashing through the hole to the area where Bond is, and there's just chaos everywhere. Bond is kind of covered in wreckage. I think, it seems to be get out of the way in time, of course, but it creates absolute carnage, not only underground but also in the streets above.
So this whole sequence essentially shows that Silver planned to get captured, and that was his way of basically getting access to MI6 and therefore escaping and then getting to Westminster, I'm assuming.
Yes, I think it will be.
Yeah. No, but that's that was his plan, wasn't it? That's just because I think otherwise, how would he know to do? He was banking on Q breaking into the laptop to trigger whatever the next steps are, and obviously, like you said about blowing up the tunnel where the train to fall down. None of that could have, just been on the fly. So his attention, was to get.
It has to be planned well in advance. And I guess if we're being kind of hypercritical here and we want to poke holes in the plot, this is where we potentially could, because yes, he might have intended to get captured in order to escape, in order to do things like plant a bomb in the underground. But how would he have known that far in advance that M was going to be up in front of the committee, for example? Did he know that? Was that well in advance, or is that just a happy coincidence? Or did he know that his actions would cause the committee to call for her? Because she might have just got fired there and then, rather than it even needing the committee. So there's a lot of assumptions being made. So if we did want to be critical and poke holes, that's where I would do it. But I don't know. What do you reckon?
No, it's a good point. So a couple of points come to mind. I wonder if he still has access to his work email. So he's probably looked at M's calendar. Oh yeah, yep, she's got a meeting there at Westminster. I'll kick off my plan there. I need to get captured. I need to get over there. But also, where you're saying about Westminster, how, for me, it's about the timing. Actually, thinking about, where you said about picking some plot holes. So when Q is trying to crack the laptop, it's actually Bond that picks out the word, which I can't remember what the word is, which then helps Q to crack the encryption software. But that all has to be timed perfectly to allow Silver to escape to get to the committee meeting in time. If it took Q a day to do, he would obviously still be in a cell when she's in the committee, unless he's worked out all the variables and goes, oh yeah, Q made it, therefore it's going to take him X amount of time, so therefore I've got a buffer of this amount of time to get here to A to B.
Yeah, there's a lot that could go wrong with this plan. He's banging it, but I guess with the skill that he's got, the hacker that he is, maybe he's thought of all these variables before putting it in place. He's a much cleverer man than you and I, that's for sure.
Indeed, yeah, and he has a better dress sense and hairstyle than me. And another point, Andy, because we're going off script a few times here. Did you know that it was when Silver was cast as, when Bardem was cast as Silver, he actually said to the directors, producers, that he wanted to kind of come up with the design in terms of his makeup and style. So then he appeared on set like the next day with his hair dyed and people didn't recognise him at first, that it was him. He put his kind of mark on it.
I did not know that. That's very interesting and very creative on his part. Yeah. And I think he did a great job with the look of the Silver character.
Yeah, and obviously, listeners, make sure you stay until we do the rankings where we rank the villains as well. So we see M mention her late husband, and she quotes a poem to the committee. So obviously, in one of the previous Dame Judi Dench films, we've seen M in bed with her partner. So we find out that is probably her husband. And also there's another one where you kind of see a husband lurking around. And Silver and a couple of goons arrive and shoot up the place as well. And obviously Andy mentioned, this in his favourite scene, and this is when Bond, Eve and Mallory are helping to defend the place as well, and Silver has to retreat, and I can't remember who it is, if it's Bond. I think it is Bond actually that shoots the extinguishers to set off the smoke to allow them to escape as well. And Bond drives off with M, and Tanner gets left behind, and we shortly see that Bond and M actually change cars to the Aston Martin DB5, which Andy mentioned earlier. And the Bond music kicks in. I thought that was really good, little scene there. And Andy, when that happened, I immediately thought of you, because you see the reg number of the Aston Martin, and I thought, oh, I wonder if Andy remembered that, or I wonder what the significance of that reg number is, because obviously you mentioned in other films that the links, or how it links to. So is there any link with this particular one?
There is indeed. So the reg BMT216A, I've not wrote that down, I just remember it because I'm sad like that. It's the same registration as the Aston Martin DB5 used in Goldfinger and Thunderball. So it is the very, very same car.
So you hope Bond looks after his car then, don't you? If he's had it all the way back to Goldfinger. So yeah, hopefully he looks after it. And Bond then teases M with the ejector seat button, which I thought was pretty good. It was a bit of nice interaction there, wasn't it? Between, even though everything that's happened, there's a bit of light humour.
I thought that it was a nice throwback to going back to the old car. The music was in the old style, so as it was in the 60s, and there's a bit of dialogue interplay between them where M says, "Where are we going?" and Bond says, "Back in time," which is obviously a nice nod as well. I guess an additional thought I had is, does that particular Aston Martin fit with the Craig era? Because obviously this was a Connery car in a different time and place, a different Bondosphere, or whatever you want to call it, like multiverse or whatever. So to have that back, I'm not sure how I feel about it, to be honest. I like it, I like it. But because of the nature of the car and the fact you've got an ejector seat button, and as we find out later on, there's more to it than meets the eye. It's not just a car, is it? As it wasn't back in then. So does that go against what they're trying to do with Craig and Bond in this era? I don't know. I'm a little bit torn on that regard, but ultimately I settle on the side of it's the coolest car there is, so I'm okay with it.
I think it's quite prevalent in the Daniel Craig era that they do little kind of nods to the previous films, which obviously, if the Daniel Craig is a reboot and it's in isolation, but they do reference the older films in the franchise.
Yeah, it's nice. And I guess if I wanted to be hypercritical, who put the gadgets on that particular car? Because obviously it can't have been Q, because Q, or maybe it was a previous Q, but obviously it wasn't the current Q because he only met him a few days prior. So and that car is clearly many, many years old. So is it passed down? Is it something that's been in MI6 for many years? I don't know. A lot of questions that could be asked there if you really wanted to poke holes again, but it's cool having the car back. It's such a cool car. I'm going to forgive any kind of continuity situation there. From there, of course, they need to go somewhere in this car, and they're off to Scotland, to Skyfall. They've made their way to the Scottish Highlands. It's just Bond and M. I think actually there's a scene just before they set off where Bond tells Q to like leave a trail of breadcrumbs that only Silver can follow. So they want to get ahead of him. They want to lay the trap. They've pulled up the side of the road. There's a really nice scenic shot here where Bond's overlooking Bond is overlooking the Highlands. M gets out of the car, and Bond is told by M that orphans always make the best recruits. And this is, again, it's not many times it's referenced, but there is reference obviously to Bond's parents dying. I think does she actually ask him, how old were you when they died?
She does, and he says something like, "You already know." So he's not participating in any kind of small talk.
Yeah, one thing I did note is at this point that the whole tone of the film changes. The music changes. It's more kind of haunting and dark. I don't know if this is the right word, but I've said that it really adds to the atmosphere of the film. It just feels like we're in a new world and things are about to kick off. It felt really, really cool and very, very different from any other Bond film.
Yeah, it is a nice little transition actually, and we are going kind of back in time here because, we are arriving at Bond's childhood home, and this is, you find out actually this is the first time in the film that it actually, you find out what Skyfall is, because the aforementioned scene between the profiler, they mention Skyfall, but you don't know the relevance of that, do you, in terms of what it means until now. We meet Kincaid for the first time, and he's the old gatekeeper at Skyfall, and Kincaid is played by English actor Albert Finney, and Andy mentioned obviously earlier on that this is the one that Sean Connery was kind of linked to earlier on in the process. And Finney is known for his work a range of different films, including Big Fish, which is a brilliant film, Erin Brockovich, Miller's Crossing, and The Bourne Ultimatum. And obviously Andy mentioned earlier on that his wife likes the Bourne films. So Silver's goons arrive, and we later see Kincaid say something like "Welcome to Scotland" when he takes out one of the goons. And Silver then arrives now. So it's like when you're playing kind of like a video game, when you have waves of baddies that you have to get through. So you've had your first wave and they've taken them out. Then Silver arrives with a small army of goons, and you've got a helicopter as well. And the helicopter is playing some kind of loud music, which I don't recall what the song is, but it was different. I think, really advertising that they come in playing this kind of song.
I'll have to find out what the song is and maybe add it to our James Bond Spotify playlist. It's kind of an old rock song, isn't it? But Silver does like to make an entrance, that's for sure. So we've kind of skipped. There's a lot that goes on in this scene. We've kind of skipped over it, some of the key points, but really you should check it out because I don't think anything we described could do it justice. But really, really cool sequence of events here. But along the way, M is shot, and you only find out actually she's been wounded when she's escaping down the tunnel later on. She doesn't tell Bond this though. I think Bond says, "Are you hurt?" And she says, "Only my pride," something along those lines. So she's lying to him again. This is a recurring theme. Silver destroys Bond's car. So bye-bye Aston Martin DB5. It's good to know you. Bond's not happy about this. And then shortly afterwards, Skyfall is blown to pieces. Bond releases gas from some canisters that he finds, and he makes his escape down the tunnel. Silver is just kind of throwing random grenades around the house as well, which was a really cool scene. He's just kind of nonchalantly wandering around the house, popping grenades through the window like he's delivering the papers. Just really adds to him. What a nasty but really cool guy. So once Bond's gone down the tunnel, we see him emerge, and he has to run across a frozen lake. So he's heading towards the chapel, which is where Kincaid and M have already made their way to earlier on. But Silver notices him, and I think he fires a shot to kind of stop him in his tracks. And there's a goon on the water, well, on the ice, I should say, with Bond. And there's a really cool scene where Bond kind of grabs the gun that's in the goon's hand and shoots round in a circle so that the ice comes away and they drop into the cold water. And I can't remember what Silver says, but he kind of dismisses this whole scene as I'm trying to think what it is. It's something along the lines of it's just so exhausting. You know, he's really not happy that he's had to get physical. It's something like, sorry, I'm rambling now, but it's something along the lines of all this running around. It's exhausting, something like that. It's just really cool scene. And then off he trots, whilst Bond and one of Silver's goons have an underwater fight in the frozen lake.
Yeah, and Silver, he makes his way to the chapel, and this is where he notices the graves of Bond's parents, which I didn't make a note here actually what their names are. And Silver, and Kincaid are actually in the chapel now, and you can tell Silver he's very unhinged, and it kind of brought back memories of Christopher Walken in A View to a Kill here. And he's talking to M and rambling on, and he tries to get M to shoot them both, so he kind of has both their heads together, and he's just talking and talking, so try to kill them both with one bullet. And then Bond arrives and kind of throws a knife into the back of Silver, and Silver like turns around and staggers slowly towards Bond, and he's kind of like on his knees, I think, at this point, and Bond says to Silver, "Last rat standing," and that's obviously linked back to when they're talking to each other on Hishima Island.
Yeah, really cool scene, and I thought Silver dying with a knife to the back was quite fitting with things that had gone on so far. I did note the names of the parents, but I don't know if I should reveal them at this point, or have you put them in the quiz for later?
No, I'm not putting them in the quiz. Go for it.
So Bond's mother is, let me see where my notes. Monique Delacroix Bond, and his father is Andrew Bond. So fine Scottish name there, Andrew. Saint Andrew, of course, of Scotland. And just randomly, just throw this out there, the Greek meaning of Andrew is manly. So there you go. Just I'll add that to my CV. That's quite the accomplishment, being born with a name I had no choice in. But anyway, so Bond is holding M, and she's in pain, and she mutters, "I did one thing right," and then she dies in Bond's arms. This will be the first Bond film in which the main villain has effectively succeeded in his ultimate goal, albeit posthumously, because he has already died at this point. And Judi Dench's M is the first M to be killed in the line of duty, which is another first for the franchise. And she is also the first M to interact with the film's main villain, which was also the case for The World Is Not Enough and Skyfall.
So yeah, let's quickly focus on Dame Judi Dench before we get back to the film. And Dench began her career in the theatre in the 1950s and went on to become one of the most celebrated actresses of her generation, especially in the UK. Some of her notable stage performances include Lady Macbeth in Macbeth, Cleopatra in Antony and Cleopatra, and the title role in Amy's View.
Yeah, very successful career in film and television as well. Arguably best known for her role as M in the James Bond franchise, a role she played from 1995 in GoldenEye to 2015, which we'll get on to next week, because you'll notice that obviously Skyfall came out in 2012. Other notable film credits include Shakespeare in Love, Notes on a Scandal, and Philomena. She's been nominated for various and numerous awards over her career. She's won an Academy Award, a BAFTA Award, and multiple Olivier Awards for her work.
So Andy, just before we get back to the film, how would you compare Dame Judi Dench M compared to the other M's that we've had so far? So we've had the OG, the original Bernard Lee played M from Dr. No to Moonraker. And then we had Robert Brown playing M from Octopussy to License to Kill. Do you have a particular favourite?
Judy is my favourite. I think she did a fantastic job. Nothing wrong with Bernard Lee and Robert Brown's portrayal. Robert Brown's probably least memorable. Maybe that's just because of the shortness of the role. Bernard Lee, obviously a staple of many, many early Bond films from the length of his tenure. But Not a lot of variation. He's the boss. He tells Bond what to do. That's his role. There's not many layers to M in the early films, but I think with Dame Judi Dench, there's more variety and more layers and a bit more involvement in films. And like, you know, the aforementioned The World Is Not Enough, where she's captured, and then in this one she's killed. So, you know, there's a lot going on. I just think she added more authority, more interest, just a really, really good portrayal. So yeah, Judi Dench's portrayal is by far my favourite.
I've not tallied this up, Andy, but from, you know, rewatching the films during season 1 of the podcast, I would say she's probably got the most screen time out of all the M's so far.
I would tend to agree. I think she's got to have, surely.
So, moving on, we're back in London and we see Bond on the rooftop, and Eve approaches Bond, and M has kindly left Bond the ugly dog from her desk in her will. That's the one that had the Union Jack style. And Eve tells Bond that she's declined returning to field work, and it is revealed that Eve is now M's new secretary, and you find out her surname is Moneypenny.
This was really well done. Very nice reveal. And we also see that Mallory is the new M, and he gives Bond his next mission. I think he plonks the file on the desk, and I think, I don't know if I'm misremembering this, but I think it says "For Your Eyes Only" on it, doesn't it? I could be wrong with that, but I think that's how it ends. And then we go to the gun. Sorry, go ahead.
Now, so I don't recall, so I would have to check that, Andy.
If it doesn't, it should.
Yeah, it would be.
So for anyone who wants to re-release the film, that's how I would change it if it's not already there. But yeah, then this is now the end of the film, when it ends with the gun barrel sequence, and it feels like this is the start of something new. It's almost like this is the thing that establishes that Craig is now Bond, and it feels like we're going to transition into something new and exciting. That's the sense I got anyway.
Yeah, and this one's interesting, isn't it? Because Casino Royale, and go back and listen to Quantum of Solace, because we talk about how that's set straight after Casino Royale as well. This one is very much a standalone film, isn't it? Because it doesn't mention the Quantum Group, does it? Or even kind of hint to Spectre in this film. It's very much a standalone, considering when you think of the Daniel Craig films we've mentioned before, or in the guest episodes, the Craig films all kind of related, but this one's actually a standalone one in the series, isn't it? It's in his run of films.
I think it very much is, yeah. I think the way they did the first two films was, you know, back to back, as it were, and then the ending of Quantum of Solace kind of drew a line under that, and then we start with the new mission, and then this kind of draws a line at this stage, so it is very much a standalone. Having said that, we've got 2 more films to go, so we'll see if it is actually a standalone or not, but as things stand, I completely agree. This is also, we've got another redesigned gun barrel sequence here for the third Craig film. I think this is the third different gun barrel sequence, isn't it?
It is, and the blood is very dark red, and Craig walks across the screen slower than usual, and he shoots one-handed again.
Yeah, and we end with the gun barrel logo, and it's celebrating 50 years of Bond, and states that James Bond will return. And indeed, he will.
The Rain Room.
So we're moving on to the next section, which is the one-liners and quotes, and this is the section that Andy mentioned earlier on. Well, sorry, this next quote is the one that Andy mentioned earlier on, that we're going to do a bit of role play. So our regular listeners will know that me and Andy usually take turns doing the one-liners and quotes, but we're going to have a go at basically being Bond, Andy. You are. This is your audition for the next Bond role.
I've been saying all along that I wanted to be Bond. Now I get the chance to do it.
So I'm going to play the role of profiler. So very generic there. That's just typical of my life. And also going to play Mallory at the end. So, and Andy's going to be Bond. So I'm not going to do any acting, Andy. I can't do voices. So I'm just going to shoot straight here. So I'm the profiler. So I'm going to say gun.
Shot.
Heart.
Target.
M.
Bitch.
Sunlight.
Swim.
Moonlight.
Dance.
Murder.
Employment.
Skyfall. Skyfall.
Done.
And then Mallory says, well, this is going well. But I think that's a nice little scene, that is, because like you said earlier, this is the whole bit around Bond missing his targets, being puffed out in his exercise test, and him just looking run down and vulnerable, isn't it? And this is his psychological assessment.
Yeah, he's trying to show that he is up for the mission, and he's got that cold heart, but obviously when the mention of Skyfall does something to him. Let's move on to another one. So this is a short one. So the interaction between Bond and M. Bond says, and it's talking about the bulldog ornament that M has on her desk, and this is after the explosion earlier. So Bond says, whole office goes up in smoke and that bloody thing survives. To which M replies, your interior decorating tips have always been appreciated, 007.
I love the banter between this version of M and James Bond. So this is a bit of a longer one, and this is between Silver and Bond. So Silver kicks us off and says, if you wanted, you could pick up your secret missions. Also, I do. Name it. Destabilize a multinational by manipulating the stocks. Beep. Easy. Interrupt transmissions from a spy satellite over Cabal. Done. Rig an election in Uganda, all to the highest bidder. Or a gas explosion in London. Just point and click. Well, everybody needs a hobby. So what's yours? Resurrection. Now, that, you know, when that happened, that kind of threw me back to Die Another Day. You know, with Colonel Moon, is it? General Moon? And he has, you know, then becomes Gustav Graves. I'm sure there's something similar where he's talking about resurrection, or, you know, because he's faked his death. Maybe I'm getting confused. I don't know. When that happened, it just brought back memories of, Gustav Graves, how he changed his face to elude everyone.
I think you might be onto something there, yeah. And also the idea that Graves is so filthy rich that he can just basically do whatever he wants. So a little bit of a different reasoning why, you know, megalomaniac versus revenge seeker, I guess, in Silver's case. But yeah, a little bit of an overlap there nonetheless. One final one for me, again between Bond and M. I think this isn't when Bond's in a flat, isn't it, if memory serves me correctly. And Bond says, I read your obituary of me. And appalling. Yeah, I knew you'd hate it. I did call you an exemplar of British fortitude. That bit was all right.
That just reminds me of a conversation I had with my wife this week, Andy, where, you know, I'm a bit morbid sometimes. So I've got a playlist on my Spotify called Funeral Playlist. And it's all the songs I want my wife to play when I have my funeral. So she said, I was, you know, just telling her about, you know, telling people at work about my funeral playlist. And she said, I'm not even going to listen to it. I'm just going to put some random song on that I know you hate at my funeral. And that just kind of reminded me of that conversation I had with my wife this week, where I can imagine her deliberately writing a really poor obituary for me, like Emma's done for James Bond. So, Andy, regular listeners, this is a Book Fest movie, and as Andy mentioned, this is going to be a very short segment this week. So as Andy mentioned, Skyfall is not related to any Ian Fleming Bond novels or short stories.
Yeah, not only that, it's also the first time that a non-Fleming titled Bond hasn't been novelised. So we have no comparisons to make. So we may as well move on to the next part of the show, hadn't we? Which is another one of my world-famous, mighty hilarious James Bond jokes. Jay, listeners, are you ready for this one?
I'm always ready, Andy. And, you know, listeners, you can find Andy's jokes on YouTube and TikTok as well. And Facebook. And all other social media platforms.
Indeed, there's no escaping the James Bond jokes. So here we go. What do you call it when James Bond crashes the US stock market?
I do not know, Andy. What do you call it?
A spy fall.
I think that is very topical at the moment as well, Andy, with certain banks crashing and the stock market. So I could see what you've done there, a bit of wordplay.
Yeah, could well be. And with the economy as it is, it's less a quantum of solace and more a quantum of absolute shit, isn't it?
Are you ready? Let's start the quiz.
New listeners, just so you know what we're doing now, this is where I pose 4 statements, all related to this film, to Andy, and Andy's got to guess which 2 statements are correct and which 2 statements are incorrect. So Andy, are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's do this.
Okay. So, first statement. This is only the second time in the Bond franchise when Bond suffers a gunshot wound. The next statement. The Komodo dragons in the floating casino were borrowed from a local conservation, and they still attract frequent Bond fans each year. The third statement. Playing the role of Q was Ben Wishaw's childhood dream. Wishaw is a geek in real life and collects games consoles and old computer systems. And the last statement for this week. Daniel Craig and Javier Bardem formed a friendship during the filming of Skyfall due to their shared love of rugby. So, American listeners, if you're not familiar with rugby, think of it as American football, but without all the padding. So, Andy, do you want me to repeat any of them, or are you happy?
I'm happy. I've jotted them all down. I like your description of rugby, by the way. I would have said to our American listeners, it's like American football, but the men aren't p***s. But that will probably alienate an audience across the pond, so I'll maybe...
The beeper is going to be busy today.
It is indeed. This, again, Jay, I have to applaud you because this is a mighty, mighty difficult selection. I could believe all 4 of these quite easily. So you've done very, very well. I am going to take what I think is a educated guess, and I'm going to say that the first statement, Bond suffering a gunshot wound for only the second time, I'm going to say that's true. Gets into plenty of scraps. Don't think he gets shot very often in the franchise, so I'm going to say that is true. I am going to say that the Komodo dragons... That's a tough one. I'm going to say false, but I don't really have a reason why. Other than I think the next statement about Ben Whishaw is true. So I can only pick 2. So, and then rugby. Daniel Craig, a rugby fan. I could see that. Javier Bardem, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how big rugby is in Spain. So I'm going to say, and this is a guess, true, false, true, false.
We can cut out that long pause there, Andy, where I was just typing up your responses. So you said true, false, true, false.
Correct.
Okay.
Well, correct, that is what I said. I don't know if it's actually correct or not.
I can confirm that you got 2 right and 2 wrong.
50% again. This seems to
It
be.
is, yeah.
Is this, 5 or 6 weeks in a row now?
So do you want to, obviously this is if you failed this week, Andy, so you can't get 100%, but do you want to have a second stab at which ones you got wrong way round?
Well, I don't consider it a failure. I'm more of a glass half full kind of guy. So 50% I'm okay with. I'm going to, if I have to re-pick, I'm going to say the gunshot wound one is false. And the rugby friendship is true. Does that change my score?
The gunshot wound is right. Bond has only been shot twice in terms of gunshot wound, so you was correct the first time. If I was offering bonus points, which I'm not, can you guess what the other film was? I give you a clue. We pointed out when it happened the fake blood, which I know we talked about quite a bit, but there was like fake blood trail. And the villains were basically following the blood splatters from Bond. Do you want me to give you a further clue?
Was it a Dalton film?
It was a Connery film, so one of the earlier ones.
Connery? Oh, wow, okay. Let me think. Would this be From Russia with Love? No, you're going to have to put me out of my misery, because I'm guessing now.
I will put you out of your misery. So it was Thunderball, and it was the bit where he was running through the carnival, and he was kind of like, do you remember, with his foot, and he was kind of like limping, dragging?
Yeah. I remember now.
So that's the...
Wow, that's...
So is that a long stint?
Yeah, I would have said maybe it would have been more recent than that. Maybe Craig was the first one that got shot, but then... Yeah, well, there you go. 48 years without being shot. That's a good record.
Yeah, and we're getting close to achieving that as well, aren't we, Andy? So that's not bad.
Some closer than others.
Every episode, Andy, I've been listening to re-listening to some of our episodes, and I need to start keeping a tally of how many times you insult my age, because it's a regular occurrence. We should be keeping track of this, my age discrimination in your episodes.
It's one of the few times in life where I actually feel good about my relative age.
So the Komodo dragons is false. So you got that right. So I made that up to say they were borrowed. Interesting fact, Andy, the Komodo dragons were actually CGI, so they were not real. So I bought the... Yeah, and I don't know if you picked this up. I didn't. But during the Komodo dragon scene, Daniel Craig was wearing gloves, but they had to use CGI and put hands on him in the film because they realised that he wouldn't be able to use his gun because it used a palm print. So apparently it cost $1 million to do the CGI to do that. So I don't know if I'm going to rewatch it just for that, but apparently you could see his hands were a bit chunky in that scene, but I never noticed it. It was when I was thinking of ideas for the quiz, yeah.
Why would he be wearing gloves? Because he's in a casino.
I know. I think it was not like, wet woolly gloves. It was kind of like the leather type that, you might drive your car in or something like that. Drive your car with.
Oh, that's raised so many questions.
Yeah, so after we finish recording, Andy, have a quick Google of his hands from the Komodo dragon scene. And the next one about Q, Ben Whishaw, and being a geek is incorrect. So at the time of filming Skyfall, he didn't actually own a computer. So I don't think he's a technophobe, but that was one I just came up with. Meaning that Daniel Craig and Javier Bardem do share a love for rugby. So again, I don't know if rugby is big in Spain, but obviously it must be big enough for him to take a fancy, because Spain aren't in the Six Nations, are they? So
they're not. No, it's England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, France, and Italy.
Yeah. So and I never see Spain in any of the games. I don't watch rugby though, but thinking of growing up, you see like all the ones from the southern hemisphere, and obviously the ones you've mentioned.
I know of those teams plus Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, and maybe Argentina. That's about it.
Yeah, I think Japan as well. But yeah, you're right. So, yeah, so 50-50, not bad. So, let's move on to our last segment, which is the rankings.
The Rain Room.
Regular listeners will know about this, but just to kind of recap. So, we're going to pick out, we're not going to pick out, we're going to talk about the rankings for a number of different elements that we monitor each week. So, again, I'm going to kick us off here. So I'm going to cover runtimes, kill count, and martini first. And runtimes, as Andy mentioned, 2 hours 23 minutes, and that is actually 1 minute shorter than Casino Royale, which is the longest running film so far. So Daniel Craig takes up slot rankings number 1, number 2, but as I mentioned earlier on, Quantum of Solace is the shortest Bond film so far. Will it be the shortest one in the whole franchise? So Bond occupies 1, 2, and bottom place. I think that's quite unique. You definitely get your value for money if you're paying Daniel Craig here.
He's all or nothing at the moment, isn't he?
He is, yes. And kill count, I mentioned 17, and that puts Skyfall in the top 10 at 9th position, so that's just shy of For Your Eyes Only with 18, and one more for Quantum of Solace. Moving on to the average across the 3 films that Daniel Craig has had so far, he's got an average of 14.7, which does mean he's still behind Pierce Brosnan, who has a very healthy or maybe unhealthy average of 33.8 across the 4 Brosnan films. And last one from me before I pass over is the Martini watch. And as Andy mentioned earlier on, he has a martini. That's James Bond and not Andy.
Indeed. No martinis for me. That'll be tracked every week as 0. So moving on to the introduction of Bond, James Bond. Comes after 56 minutes and 39 seconds, as mentioned earlier. We've had the introduction 19 times out of the 23 films so far, and this is the 4th longest or 16th shortest, whichever way you want to look at it, in terms of how long it takes to appear. So only License to Kill, A View to a Kill, and Casino Royale do we hear it after the time it takes to hear it in Skyfall. We have no hat wearing, no hat throwing, and we also have no Felix Leiter. So Jeffrey Wright appeared in the first 2 Craig films, but no appearance by him or any other actor playing the role of Felix Leiter in Skyfall. Moving on, this is the segment that really gets Jay's juices flowing. We're talking money now. So the box office. As mentioned earlier, $200 million budget, which is the 2nd highest budget of any film behind Quantum of Solace. What that led to in terms of box office was a monumental $1.1 billion in actual box office, which adjusted to today is around $1.4 billion. So both in actual and adjusted, it is top of the pile. The most successful Bond film of all time so far. Quite the achievement. Just to add a little bit more context to that, so this is something we've added in for this week, is looking at the average per actor. So from an adjusted box office perspective, Daniel Craig has taken a total of just over $3 billion in box office receipts, for an average of just over $1 billion across his 3 films. So in terms of averages, he is top of the pile, just ahead of Sean Connery. I'll quickly run through the list, because I think this is the first time we've gone through this in any great detail, but Connery has an adjusted box office figure of just under $5.5 billion across his 6 films, so an average of $914.9 million. Roger Moore in 3rd place, $4.8 billion total adjusted box office, for an average of $690 million, just under. Lazenby's one out in gives an adjusted box office figure of $653.5 million. Brosnan in 5th place with a total adjusted box office of over 2.5 billion for an average of just under 650 million. And Dalton, quite a way down the list actually in comparison. 2 films with an adjusted box office of 853.7 for an average of 426.85. So Craig, so far, is clearly the most successful actor on average on a per film basis when you look at adjusted box office. So another way of looking at things for you stats fans out there.
So that's the section that gets my juices flowing. So now let's move on to the section that gets Andy's juices flowing, and that's the Bond girls. So I'm going to kick us off. And Andy mentioned at the top of the pod there was only 2 Bond girls in Skyfall. And for me, you know, we've said this for quite a few weeks now, that there's so many Bond girls, so we're just going to pick out where these ones land. So there's 74 Bond girls at this point in time for Skyfall, and Bond's lover comes in at 73, so that's 1 place below Marie and 1 place behind the generic private jet hostess from Moonraker. And Severine comes in, you could say it's disappointing, is it though, in 42nd place for me, and that is 1 place lower than Dr. Christmas Jones and 1 place higher than Naomi from The Spy Who Loved Me. And the justification for that, Andy and listeners, is the Bond girls above Severin is Christmas Jones, Mayday, Merry Goodnight, and then you've got some of the old classics like Andrea Anders from The Man with the Golden Gun, Tilly Masterson from Goldfinger, and then even going a bit more modern day, Natalia Simonova from Goldeneye. And I just couldn't place her higher than that, Andy, in my rankings, because, you know, like I said earlier, in terms of screen time and in terms of helping Bond, or, you know, being useful in terms of you know, in terms of the plot and helping Bond. So you got like Christmas Jones, who Denise Richards is obviously very gorgeous, but, you know, she's a nuclear physicist, and she helped, you know, Bond with, you know, getting the villain in The World Is Not Enough. Whereas Severin, you know, she didn't really do that for me, and that's why I kind of justify just above mid-table, that is, isn't it, actually, for me. So yeah, that's where it is. How about you, Andy? Where did you put Bond's lover and Severin?
I think you mean just below mid-table. If she's 42, you've got 74, but around mid-table for sure. Bond's lover, 72 out of 74. We see her very, very briefly. She's there. Bond is busy with her for seconds on screen. Then we see her in bed, and then we never see her again. So, you know, thanks for coming. Literally. I'll cut that. For me, I place Severin slightly higher up. I put her in 25 out of 74. And again, similar to you, it's screen time, or lack thereof, that's kind of letting her down. She's integral to the plot, which goes in her favour. She's an interesting character. She just needed more time on screen, I think, to be justified any higher. So where that places her is just below Solange from Casino Royale, and just above Miranda Frost from Die Another Day. She reminded me of a Miranda Frost type in some regards, although very different characters and portrayals. That was just kind of the name that came to mind as a reference point. So 25 out of 74, kind of a third of the way up the table. And, you know, arguably the Bond girls this film were the one weakness, if there is even a weakness in this film, but still respectable for Severine. Now let's talk theme songs. So Skyfall, sung by Adele. I struggled with this initially. I like the song. I'm not an Adele fan, and I do wonder whether a different song by a different artist would have placed higher. I don't know. But to give Adele her due, she did a cracking job with Skyfall. And for me, this comes in at number 7 out of the 23 we've had so far. Just below Chris Cornell's You Know My Name, which I thought was really, really good, and just above License to Kill by Gladys Knight. It's a throwback song, isn't it? We're going back to the old ballad type, and I think it's exactly the type of song that this film needed, particularly celebrating 50th anniversary. A good song. Comfortably top half of the table. And for someone like me, who's not an Adele fan, I've been very respectful of her there. What say you, Jay? Does she fare any better on your side?
No, in short. I'm the same, Andy. Adele is not someone I will tend to listen to. I do like some of her major hits, but I was a bit surprised with this one because, I say this a lot on the podcast when I do the theme song rankings. I re-listen to them. So Andy mentioned about the playlist we got on Spotify. So what I do is I re-listen to the song while we are writing the notes, and I will think, okay, this is where I think it is. And then what I did with this one, Andy, was actually I listened to Gladys Knight, License to Kill, and GoldenEye initially because I'm thinking, Skyfall's going to go in, top 5. And then I reminded myself, listen to License to Kill, GoldenEye, and I'm thinking like, no, Skyfall's not better than them. So then I went down to like Aha, and again, no, moving on, Paul McCartney and Wings, and then I got to Thunderball. I said, yeah, I prefer it to Thunderball, but not Live and Let Die. So that's the approach I take every week with the theme song. But I was a bit surprised because this is one of the songs that the wife does like for the Bond themes. So she likes this one and the Billie Eilish song as well. They're the ones, when I've got the Spotify James Bond rating room playlist playing, they're the songs that she tends to listen to as well. So respectable top 10, but before ranking them I thought would have come higher. So moving on, we've got the opening credits. So obviously mentioned at the top of the podcast what this entails, and this is Bond sinking, swallowed by the seabed, usual naked models, we got graveyards, we got lots of target practice cutouts, targets on fire, we've got Asian dragons, skulls, and I think it closes with Craig's blue eyes. It definitely zooms in. So for me, I think it was a very, very strong opening title credits sequence. I really liked it, and I was looking at these rankings, Andy, and I've made a few notes with some of the other ones, and especially with the Roger Moore era. I do like it when they have the Bond actor in the opening credits, so you do get some bonus points there. But for me, it just fell short of breaking the top 3. So it came in at number 4, and that is one higher than Tomorrow Never Dies, which I did really like, and one short of On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And the reason why it didn't make the top 3 is because I just love On Her Majesty's Secret Service, where they have the kind of throwbacks and the snapshots of the previous characters. So I really like that. So like we've mentioned before, that is like when Honey Rider's in there from Dr. No, Tatiana, Pussy Galore, Goldfinger, Thunderball. So that's the only reason why it didn't break the top 3. What about you, Andy?
I really, really enjoyed this title sequence. Thought it was fantastic, and for that reason I put it in at number 2. Only Live and Let Die beats it for me, which I thought was really, really cool with the whole voodoo influence. But aside from that, it was fantastic. It was a good mix of the old school way of doing Bond title sequences mixed in with the new technology and all the benefits that brings. So yeah, silver medal position as things stand. Next up, we have the villains. Got 3 to choose from this week. We have Raul Silva, we have Patrice, and we have the boat captain. I'm going to go reverse order. So by my count, we have 87 villains in this list now. So this is getting really, really difficult to differentiate. Boat captain goes in at 73. Not a lot to say about boat captain. is just kind of there. Another one of those henchmen that's on the list. Oh, sorry, another one of those villains that's on the list. He's, you see him, and then he goes, and it's like, is he really needed in this film? I'm not sure. Now there's a big jump to my next place, and that's Patrice, who I've got all the way up in 19. Now, you mentioned that Patrice didn't actually say anything throughout this, and I don't think that hampered my view of him in this film. I thought it was a really, really strong villain. I think the opening fight scene on the train is incredible. I think the subsequent fight scene that they have in Shanghai is another fantastic scene, and he's physically, at least, very much Bond's equal. I don't think Bond really gets the better of him until he does right at the end of that Shanghai scene, but it's touch and go for a long, long time. And so it's a really, really cool physical match for Bond, and I thought it was fantastic. So he goes in at 19, just below Zorin and just above Telly Savalas' portrayal of Blofeld. So Raoul Silva, this is where we have breaking news. Top of the pile. Someone has finally dislodged Ulrich Goldfinger from the top of the list for me. I thought Javier Bardem was incredible in this role. I think the layers that the villain has, the stage, not the stage presence, the screen presence, that would make more sense since it's a film, not a play. The screen presence is really, really good, and I just really, really loved his portrayal. I thought that he's a fantastic villain, and him and Craig play off each other very, very well. And one of the reasons why I'm such a fan of this film is Javier Bardem. So yeah, top of the pile. That's going to take some beating, isn't it? But what say you, Jay? Where do those three men rank on your list?
So for you, Andy, it's taken since Goldfinger to dislodge the top two, because obviously Oddjob is number 3 as well. And I wonder, you talked about the chemistry. I wonder if it's because their shared love of rugby has helped forge that friendship and that chemistry. But I agree, Boat Captain, a generic villain, so you can't really justify the Boat Captain going much higher, really. So I said 78 compared to your 73. So interesting, Andy. I just noticed Craig Mitchell from Quantum of Solace is 1 place higher on both our lists. So in the ballpark, I'm happy with those rankings. Now, Patrice is a very good villain, no talking part. So that kind of brought Patrice down for me, but he did enter in 36 out of 87. So I still think that's respectable for a villain that is in 2 scenes from memory. I think I do think that's respectable. When you look at about, 1 spot above is Gustav Graves, who's obviously the primary villain from Die Another Day, and General Orlov in Octopussy, that you could say joint primary villain as well from Octopussy. So I think that's respectable for a supporting villain. Now, Silver didn't get number 1 for me. He did come in the top 10, but just missed out of the top 5. And Andy, this is a similar approach I take with villains, with kind of like the theme songs. So Bardem, I thought, for me, was definitely top 10, and then it was very much kind of either work from the top or work from the bottom in terms of the top 10. And I was playing around actually between Red Grant and Silver, and it was like, oh, does he kind of make the top 5, does he not? And I ended up settling on position 6, and I can't really expand because I don't think there's really many, if any, negative points in terms of Silver. It's just, for me, I do prefer the whole Red Grant interactions with Connery and Jaws and Blofeld, Telly Savalas and Donald Pleasance, and just to recap, Goldfinger's my number one. So it's strong entries for Skyfall in terms on the villain side of things. So I think that's respectable. Now, kind of moving on to the movies, I've obviously said at the top of the pod it was 8 out of 10. Now, I've got a few films 8 out of 10. So I've got On Her Majesty's Secret Service in number 2, From Russia With Love number 3, Casino Royale, which is obviously Daniel Craig's debut, at number 4, GoldenEye, which is Brosnan's debut, at number 5. Now, Skyfall got 8 out of 10, and for me it was just short of GoldenEye and Casino Royale. I came so close, Andy, with I nearly got to the point where I was going to send you some stuff without actually putting my ranking in, because I was still a bit undecided. I was quite firm on the 8 out of 10, but I was like going, oh, is it better than Casino Royale or is it not? And then I'm thinking, how does it compare to like Brosnan's GoldenEye? And because we've said before, we're not having any films in joint positions on, in the rankings, I thought, oh no, I did like Casino Royale and like the narrative and the building up, even though there's less action scenes to it. But I think, the Skyfall, like you said, has the perfect blend of the kind of main ingredients of a Bond film, maybe with the argument of a bit more Bongo in there. So for me, it was 6th position. How about you, Andy? Obviously, you mentioned 10 out of 10.
Indeed, 10 out of 10. Top of the pile. It's dislodged Casino Royale, which itself dislodged Goldfinger after a long stretch at the top. Just loved everything about this film. I take on board your point around Bond girls, but I don't think it took away from the film, really. Just a fantastic film all round. Can it be beat? Can we have another 10 out of 10 in the last two films? I guess we'll find out. And will you get the magic 10 paddle out, as it were? I guess we will find out soon enough. But yeah, top of the pile, 10 out of 10. So Craig occupies the first 2 spots for me with his films. So let's swiftly move on to movies by actor. So obviously for me, Skyfall is the best Daniel Craig film so far. Just a very quick recap: Skyfall 10 out of 10, Casino Royale 9 out of 10, Quantum of Solace 7 out of 10, giving an average of 8.6 out of 10 for Craig so far. Jay, do you want to just recap yours?
Yeah, so Casino Royale 8 out of 10, Skyfall 8 out of 10, Quantum of Solace 6 out of 10. So that was a total of 22 out of 30 and 7.3 average out of 10. So moving on, we've had all Bond actors now. So we've obviously, like Andy said, we've still got a couple more films to go. And at the moment, Andy, I'm so stuck with this one. So honest about this. So at the moment, I've got Connery, in terms of the Bond actor rankings, Connery, starting from top to bottom, Connery, Brosnan, Moore, Craig, Dalton, Lazenby. And I am struggling. I think, by the time we finish the podcast, I think I'll probably move Craig up to number 3, if I'm being honest, Andy. Just above Roger Moore, based on the quality of the films. But I haven't made that decision just yet. But for me, Connery and Brosnan are my favourite. So Craig being 3 or 4, I don't think that's disrespectful. How about you, Andy?
No surprise, Craig stays top of the pile for me. He's going to have to monumentally cock things up in the last 2 films, I think, to drop down. But just to recap, I have Craig followed by Connery, Brosnan, Moore, Lazenby and Dalton are my Bond actors in order as things stand. And that kind of brings us to the end of the podcast, and I cannot think of anything really to end with in terms of a witticism or a joke or anything really. I think what we've witnessed is a fantastic film that's going to take some beating, But next week, we're kind of going back in time in some regards, because for the first time in 35, 40 years, we have a familiar foe back on the scene. And you won't need me to tell you who he is, because the title of the film says it all. Because next week, we're going to be talking about Spectre.
Well, that's this week's episode done. We hope you enjoyed it.
Special thanks to the band Sugar Tongue for the theme tune to The Rating Room. You can find them on all the usual social media channels, and be sure to check out their song The System, available now on Spotify.
You can find and message us on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok and Instagram by searching The Rating Room.
You'll find all our social media links on our website, theratingroom.com, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Or feel free to drop us an email at theratingroom@gmail.com. Goodbye, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week, right here on The Rating Room.
The Rating Room.